Summer 1966, Gary, Indiana. I still remember vividly our tiny living room in Gary, Indiana, a space so small that if you turned around too hard, your hand would hit the wall. Yet that small room was like a miniature universe where all the Jackson brothers' musical dreams were formed, revolving around the one thing we had more of than anyone could imagine: music. Michael was only 8 years old then, small, mischievous, and full of curiosity. He was always running after me, Jackie, Jermaine, wanting to see us play the guitar or practice the chorus. There were nights when we didn't have much to eat, but we always had music. My father, though strict, always told us that music was something that could open doors that life hadn't shown us. And perhaps that's why, every time the sound of the guitar rang out, Michael felt drawn by an invisible force. There was always a rhythm to our living room: Jackie's tapping feet, Marlon's humming, the sound of my guitar strings. But what really made that little room special was Michael's voice. That little boy had a timbre that made people stop and listen. He didn't just sing right, he sang like he knew what he was saying, which is rare for a child. I'll never forget those hot summer afternoons. The windows were wide open and the wind blew in, carrying the smell of dust and the sound of trucks from the nearby steel mill. But every time Michael sang, the dusty noise was pushed back, replaced by a clear, bright sound like sunlight streaming through the window. One time I was tuning my guitar when I heard my neighbors outside say, "Hey, the Jackson kids are practicing again. The little one is so good." I smiled because they didn't know the little guy was only 8. Every time Michael sang, the neighborhood kids would gather around my window. Some would dance, some would tap the wall, some would widen their eyes as if they were watching a real show. At times I thought, this kid is definitely not made to sing in the living room. But then, immediately, a feeling of anxiety came over me. He's too young. Will he be able to handle the pressure? Will the spotlight scare him, make him want to turn his back on music? Part of me always worried that Michael, with his sensitive heart and artistic soul from a young age, might stumble over the challenges that we, the older brothers, had struggled with for years. We'd rehearse for small local gigs, but for an 8-year-old, all of that could be too big, too bright, too loud. But I had to admit, Michael was different from us. The way he stood in front of the mirror, practicing shrugging, tilting his head, squinting, was completely different from a child imitating. He had a stage feel, an instinct that no one could teach. And then there was a day I will never forget. It was an evening when the whole family was practicing for an upcoming performance. Jackie was tapping the beat, Jermaine was playing the backing, I was adjusting the guitar. Michael stood in the middle of the living room, small but full of energy. He closed his eyes, preparing to sing, and in that moment I saw before me not my 8-year-old brother, but a little artist entering my world. But behind that confidence I still felt something fragile. That boy had never stood in front of a big stage, had never faced bright lights shining directly into his eyes, had never heard the audience clapping or making noise. When that moment really came, would he be able to keep his composure? Sometimes I saw him pause while practicing. It wasn't the voice, it was the mind. It was as if something was going on in his head whenever he imagined himself in front of a crowd. He would take a deep breath, then try to sing the previous part again. And at that moment, for the first time in my life, I felt the fear of a real brother. I was afraid he would get hurt. I was afraid that just one moment of stumbling would make him lose faith in himself. At that time, I didn't know that the moment that many people later passed on, the story of Michael forgetting the lyrics, was waiting for us on the next stage. Although it was an anecdote, no one was 100% sure, but the feeling of anxiety before it, I remember clearly. Before everything actually happened, I only knew one thing. This small living room was harboring a dream so big that none of us could have predicted. And the boy standing in the middle of that room, Michael, was about to enter a world where only the strongest, most persistent people could shine. I am Tito Jackson, and that was the first moment I realized. Genius is sometimes born in small rooms, but to shine, it must face no small amount of fear. That evening, our small living room suddenly became a real rehearsal stage. The pale yellow light from the hanging bulb looked like the stage lights we used to see on old TV. Everyone was there. My father wanted the rehearsal to be serious. Everyone in the right place, playing the right beat, singing the right lines. Jackie was tapping her foot to keep the tempo. Jermaine, in his deep voice, was getting ready to open, and I was holding my guitar. The feeling was just as nervous as the real show. And Michael, he stood a little back, his hands clasped together in front of his stomach, a habit he did when he was nervous. I looked into his eyes, and there was a flicker of worry. Even though he was only 8, he knew very well that this was an important rehearsal. In a few days, we would be performing in front of a group of adults who could change the future of our family. I strummed the guitar. The rehearsal began. Michael took a step forward out of habit, tilting his shoulders slightly to make it look more natural. He took a deep breath, preparing to speak. And then, the fateful moment came like a sharp cut through the air. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His eyes widened, staring into space, then at us. His face paled. His small hands trembled slightly. I remember standing there frozen. For those few seconds that felt like eternity, I actually felt like time had stopped. Jermaine turned to look at Michael, saying nothing, but his eyes were also filled with confusion. Jackie tapped her foot out of rhythm. My dad was about to speak, but he paused, perhaps to see if Michael could extricate himself from this impasse, and I could hear my heart pounding. I wanted to say something to him, but my throat felt tight. He, the 8-year-old boy shining like a lamp, was standing in the middle of the living room, unable to remember the words to the song, although many people later recounted and told anecdotes about Michael forgetting the words when he was little, and that I had recounted the story at that moment as his older brother. I didn't care if it became an anecdote or not. I was just worried that the moment would make him lose confidence. The boy took a breath, but instead of singing, he looked down at the floor. His shoulders slumped a little, just a little, but enough for me to feel the fear rising in him. My father took a step forward, calling his name in a stern voice. Michael looked up, but his eyes were wet. I knew he was fighting not to cry, not because of pain, but because of disappointment in himself. That night, I felt for the first time the weight of my older brother's responsibility. I had performed many times. I forgot the beat, the wrong chords, the wrong passages, but I was older, stronger, and used to keeping my cool. And Michael, he was only 8 years old, but he had placed such high expectations on himself. I wondered, what if he was so scared that he didn't dare perform anymore? What if a moment like that shattered his confidence? No one in the room said anything, but we all felt the heavy silence. Then suddenly, Michael turned away. I thought he would run out, like many other children when they were too nervous, but he didn't. Michael walked to the corner of the room, turned his back, and took deep breaths, as if trying to gather his lost courage. I heard him say to himself very quietly, "I can do it, I can do it." I stood there watching, feeling as if that little shadow was fighting a wave that even adults could hardly resist. My father was silent, not shouting, not pushing. That added to the tension in the room. I gripped the neck of the guitar, a jumble of thoughts racing through my head. Part of me wanted to run to him and hug him to calm him down. Part of me thought he needed to learn to overcome his own fears. A few dozen seconds later, but to me it felt like minutes, Michael returned. The slumped shoulders were gone. The bewildered eyes were gone. Instead, a small boy stood there, but his eyes were strangely bright, as if he had found something within himself. He nodded at me, a very slight nod, but enough to make me let go of the breath I didn't know I was holding. I asked quietly, "Are you okay, Mike?" He replied, his voice trembling but determined. "Let me try again." Just 4 simple words, but I'd never heard an 8-year-old speak with such determination. I strummed the guitar strings again. Jackie tapped her foot. Jermaine got ready to join in. Michael stood in the right place, closed his eyes, took a deep breath. And this time, he sang. He didn't just sing right. He sang like he'd just run out of a storm and found new strength. His voice was clear, rich, full of determination. The small room shook. I saw neighbors standing outside their windows, heads tilted in, listening, unaware they were witnessing a moment that would make a legend. In that moment, I understood. Michael was more than a kid who sang. He was a kid who stood up. And I, Tito Jackson, witnessed it right there in our tiny living room. After the night Michael forgot the lyrics, a story that would be passed around forever, our little house was quieter than usual. Not a heavy silence, but the kind of silence that seemed like everyone was waiting to see what the 8-year-old would do next. I remember the next morning clearly. Sunlight filtered through the living room window onto the faded sofa and my guitar leaning against the wall. I planned to practice with Jackie and Jermaine, but before I could strum a note, I heard something very soft from the corner. It was Michael. He stood with his back to the wall, his small shoulders shrugging to the beat. He didn't know we were awake and watching. He opened his mouth to sing, very softly, as if testing the sound before anyone else heard it. I moved closer, slowly, not wanting to startle him. I could hear him whisper to himself, "Don't forget, don't forget." My heart sank. The night before, I'd worried that the pause would give him stage fright. But what I saw the next morning was the exact opposite. Michael didn't hide. He didn't beg for time off. He didn't blame his young age or the pressure. He decided to face it, and that was the moment I knew. The events of the previous night hadn't weakened him. They'd made him stronger. From that day on, Michael changed in a way I think only adults who have been through a lot of hardship can. He practiced more. He repeated the pause over and over again as if trying to inculcate it into a reflex. He asked me how to memorize with emotion, something I didn't know where he learned it from. That 8-year-old boy began to sing, not just with words, but with feeling. He sang as if the lyrics were a story he had to tell, not just words he had to memorize. Many times I would be strumming when I heard footsteps running, and Michael would appear before me, panting as if he had just thought of something very important. "Tito, here. Should I extend this note a little bit?" Or, "Tito, if I close my eyes here, will it sound better?" I laughed, patting his head. "If that's how you feel, try it." And he tried, failed, tried again, failed again, and tried again until he succeeded. That kind of persistence, I swear, not every 8-year-old has. At night, when everyone else was asleep, I would still hear him singing softly in the room, not to show off, not to be praised, but to overcome his fear. I know because sometimes I stand outside the door and hear him stop mid-sentence, then breathe heavily as if struggling with the memory of that forgotten line. Once he found me standing outside the door. He blushed a little but didn't run away or hide. I asked, "Mike, aren't you tired? It's very late." He looked at me, his bright eyes like they were holding a small fire. "I want to be sure." "Certain about what?" He pursed his lips. That day won't come back to me." I didn't know what to say right away, but in that moment, I understood that Michael wasn't practicing to be a star. He was practicing to not let himself down. And then, a few days later, we rehearsed again. The air in the living room was as thick as before a storm. Everyone felt the importance of this. If we did well, my father would let us perform at the next venue, where the people who could usher in a new future would be present. I strummed the first chords. Jackie tapped her foot. Jermaine began the opening chords. Michael stepped forward. He took a deep breath, which I knew was to clear his mind. I saw his hands clench and unclench. A tiny sign, but I had been with him long enough to understand. He was concentrating as hard as he could. And then he sang. There was no more trembling, no more bewildered eyes, no more gasping for air. Instead, the boy sang with such a resonant, strong, emotional voice that I almost forgot he was 8. Every line he sang was clear, soulful, colorful. It moved from note to note as if it had been practiced 100 times, which in fact it had been practiced 100 times. I looked at Jermaine. He was trying to hide his smile too. Jackie was tapping harder, really excited. My dad stood with his arms crossed, but I saw the corners of his mouth turn up. Not because he was being easygoing, but because he knew what was happening. Michael was back, and back many times stronger. At the end of the song, the room fell silent, then applause broke out. From my dad, then from my brothers, then from the kids peeking out the window. Michael stood there, breathing lightly, not laughing, just looking at us with a look that seemed to ask, "You did it, right?" I walked over and put my arm around his shoulder. "You didn't just do it. You just broke your own limit." And in that moment I knew a star had just awakened, not because of talent, but because of will. The night we stood on stage, that fateful stage, I still remember every detail like slow motion. It wasn't a grand theater, no fancy lights or fancy props, just a modest local club performance room where Motown often came to scout new talent. But to us, it was like Madison Square Garden. The atmosphere backstage was so thick it could crush the heart of anyone who wasn't brave enough. Jackie stood with his arms crossed, eyes closed, breathing deeply. Jermaine tuned his bass. I checked my guitar for the 10th time. Michael, the boy who had forgotten the lyrics just days before, stood silently in a corner, his hand lightly gripping the microphone as if whispering something to himself. I walked over and asked, "Hey Mike, you okay?" He looked at me, his eyes bright but strangely calm. "Okay, this time I'll tell my story. I'll tell my..." The answer sent shivers down my spine, not because it was strong, but because it was real. We stepped onto the stage, the noise of the audience mixed with laughter, the sound of chairs being pushed back, the soft click of suitcases against glasses. It was a normal scene, but my heart raced as my eyes fell on the man sitting in the second row. Berry Gordy, the man who could change our lives with a nod. He sat upright, his arms crossed, the look of a man who had heard too much, seen too much, and was not easily impressed. Next to him were a few Motown employees, the people who were always tasked with spotting stars. I swallowed. Jackie glanced at me. He knew the importance of this show, too. My father stood in the distance, arms crossed, solemn but filled with expectation. Before we began, I glanced at Michael. The boy closed his eyes, took a slow breath, then opened them again, the look no longer of an 8-year-old, but of an artist entering a moment of destiny. I strummed the first chord. A clear, crisp sound echoed throughout the auditorium. Jermaine entered the bass. Jackie tapped the stage with her shoe. The air dropped, and then Michael stepped forward. At that moment, all the noise in the room seemed to be reduced to zero. The boy held the mic with both hands, an action that seemed childish, but exuded an unmistakable sincerity. He raised his head, the yellow light shining on his chubby face, and he sang. Oh my God. He sang. I had heard Michael sing hundreds of times in the small living room, but that moment, nothing could have prepared us for it. He didn't just hit the right note. He didn't just have a bright tone. It sang as if the soul of the song was flowing through it. Its voice echoed through the rows, climbed up the walls, filled every empty space in the room, drawing all eyes to it. The audience who were chatting fell silent. The one who was drinking stopped mid-sentence. I saw every pair of eyes turn to the stage. But what almost made me miss a chord was the moment I looked down at the second row. Berry Gordy leaned forward. He no longer had his arms crossed. He was listening. Something I had never seen in any young performance at that time. The song continued, and each line of Michael's voice was like a small wave, but so powerful, so full of emotion that I had to restrain myself from being overwhelmed so as not to miss a beat. He turned at the right moment, entering the climax with a slight turn of the head, the turn the world would later call Michael Jackson magic. But at that moment, he was just an 8-year-old standing on stage. Every time he opened his mouth, Berry Gordy closed his eyes as if he were tasting each note. At the end, the hardest part, Michael straightened up, lifted the mic, and stretched out a high note with a confidence I had never felt at his age. The sound rang out, longer than I thought an 8-year-old could hold. And then, when it ended, there was a pause. A dangerous pause. A pause that almost made me forget how to breathe. Then, surprisingly and most clearly, I saw Berry Gordy stand up. No one had time to react because everything had happened so fast. He stood up, leaned forward, eyes wide as if he couldn't believe the sound had come from the kid in front of him. I clearly heard a Motown employee whisper to him, "That kid, he's special." I wanted to scream, "I knew it," but I just smiled and continued playing the final chords. The room erupted in applause. Not polite applause, not applause for a child performing, but applause for a true talent. Michael turned to look at us. A small, very small smile appeared, the smile of someone who had just conquered his greatest fear. I walked over and put my hand on his shoulder. "Mike, you made Berry Gordy stand up." And I knew, from that moment, the fate of Michael Jackson and the Jackson 5 was on a completely different path. As the applause died down and the stage lights closed, I stood still for a few seconds, my hand still on Michael's shoulder, as if I needed a moment to understand that what had just happened was not a dream. An 8-year-old boy, my little brother, had made Berry Gordy stand up. What hundreds, thousands of people had dreamed of all their lives, Michael had done when he was barely taller than our kitchen table. But what moved me most was not the fact that we could sign a Motown contract or the bright path that lay ahead. No. What choked me up was the moment I realized Michael was no longer the kid trembling in his living room trying to find the words. He had weathered his own storm and won. When we returned backstage, the whole family rushed to hug Michael. He could only smile, his eyes sparkling, but not with fear like the day he forgot the words, but with relief. Relieved that he had accomplished what he had set out to do. My father put his hand on his shoulder and said a simple sentence, "Good job, son." To anyone else, that might have been a normal statement, but to Michael and to us, it was the biggest acknowledgement. I saw him bite his lower lip, as if trying to keep his emotions from spilling over. As we were leaving the club, Gordy walked into the room. Without introduction, without preamble, he looked straight at Michael and said, "You've got something special, real special." Michael stood still, his feet slightly together, the shy but proud way of a boy who knows he has surprised adults. I saw his small shoulders rise slightly, as if he were accepting his new destiny. On the way home, the car shook over the bumps, but no one noticed. The car was silent, the silence of being overwhelmed after a big milestone. Jackie looked out the window. Jermaine folded his arms, thinking about the future. And Michael, he sat next to me, his head resting on my shoulder, and fell asleep without realizing it. I looked down at his face. Under the passing streetlights, I could see the traces of the long day. His eyebrows slightly furrowed with concentration, a little tired from putting all his effort into the stage. But still there was that peace that was so typical of Michael. I whispered softly, "You did it, Mike." And he, even in his sleep, smiled very slightly, as if his dream was singing too. The following days were a whirlwind: meetings, auditions, contracts, gossip about the little boy who sang like an old soul. Some people in the neighborhood even came over to my house, saying that they stood outside the club that night and heard the whole auditorium cheering. They pushed through the door, saw a little boy standing in the middle of the stage as if it belonged there, and I know it's true. The stage, big or small, had belonged to Michael all along. It was just that day the world began to realize it. But as everyone rejoiced, I thought of something that not many people saw. The journey between forgetting the words and making Gordy stand up lasted only a few days, but its weight felt like a lifetime of adulthood. Michael wasn't born strong. He made it himself. He stumbled, then stood up. He was scared, then sang. He trembled, then walked straight into the spotlight. I was there. I saw every up and down, every moment he doubted himself, every moment he overcame. Part of me wanted to keep that version of Michael, the little brother running around the living room, his eyes lighting up every time he heard me pluck the strings. But another part of me knew genius never stays in a small room. A genius born to step onto the stage and make people like Gordy stand up. That night, after everything had calmed down, I went back to my room and lay down, but I couldn't sleep. My mind went back to the moment he stood still in the living room when panic choked his voice. Then I remembered the moment he whispered, "Never forget again," while practicing alone. And finally, the moment he stepped onto the stage and sang like he was born to do it. I realized people are not defined by the moment they stumble, but by how they get back up. And Michael, at 8, understood that more deeply than many adults. That day, a little boy stepped over himself to step into his destiny. I, Tito Jackson, was lucky enough to witness it all up close. And every time I look back, I always think, that legend was not made on the big stage. The legend was born from a tiny living room, a big fear, and a heart that never gave up.